So welcome everybody. My name is Mary. I work with the Community Data Program. I'm your host of your webinar today. Welcome to our webinar series. You're more than welcome to ask questions along the way during our presentation. And you use that chat box that you can see people typing in on the right-hand side of your screen. So this is the place to write any technical questions. If you're having a problem with audio, we want to know that as soon as possible so we can try to deal with it. And then also if you have any presentation questions, if you have any questions for Sean or myself, we will do our best to answer you. And I also have my colleague Mike as well, and so he's here and he can answer some of our more intense data questions as well along the way. If you have any questions for him, we'll make sure we get to them. So we have a wonderful presentation today, looking at getting a greater impact out of community data through advocacy and working with media. Our presenter today is Sean Moore. Sean is the principal and founder of Advocacy School. I strongly suggest you check out his website, especially if advocacy is at all part of your mandate. If you work at all and advocacy is tagged into what you're doing, it's really worthwhile to take some time and look through what he's got to offer. Sean has spent much of his career working in public policy as a partner and a policy advisor in a law firm. He's currently focusing on advocacy training. Sorry, everybody with the beeps, that's just people logging in, and it's going to probably calm down as we get going here. Sean currently focuses on advocacy training for groups like First Nations here in Canada, as well as with NGOs abroad. So Sean and I actually sat down together a few weeks ago, and we talked about data and advocacy, and I got really excited, and I hope you're going to get really inspired with this presentation and start thinking about sort of bring your data and make a greater impact with it around your community. So I'm going to pass this off to Sean now. And Sean, what we're going to do, Sean's going to move around a little bit and show you these templates and things. So we're going to share Sean's screen. So Sean, sorry folks, this will just take a minute. So Sean, you can go ahead and click on that share my screen button.
Okay, I just got to find those documents here now. I had them all lined up. Okay, I'm ready to go. I'll find them when the time is appropriate.
Okay, hang on. Our wheel is turning here. I don't quite see your screen yet, but it seems to be working. It's taking a second. All right, there we go. Sean, we are now seeing your screen. You are live.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I can't see the screen, but that's... are we going to use my PowerPoint or your PowerPoint?
Yeah, so if you bring your PowerPoint out, and then it'll be easier for you to go between your documents.
Okay, good. So you can see that?
There, yep, now you're in slide mode. Solid.
No, that's
all right, so I'll mute myself that's all right. I'm going to mute myself so that we don't get feedback on my end. You go.
There we are. Sorry about that. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Mary, and I'm glad we were able to follow up that last discussion with this event today. I'm usually based in Ottawa, but I am a weather refugee from Ottawa, talking this morning from Salt Spring Island, BC. It's very green here. But enough about the weather, on to the content. Here's what we're going to do today, hopefully in about 25 to 30 minutes, but we have a total of an hour and a half, so lots of opportunity for questions and further discussion on the matters relevant to the use of data in public policy making. I want to quickly run through what I've kind of framed as my objectives for this webinar in terms of what I can pass on to you. And a fair bit of it has to do with the mainstream media and learning how to deal with the mainstream media as at least one of the vehicles for the sort of data that you and your colleagues produce. I'm then going to suggest about 7 ideas that can be considered by you individually, but also in community data programs, working collaboratively. Because I think there's two levels at which promotion of the use of data in policy making and understanding the broad implications of issues is what we'll be focusing on. I'm then going to finish off with just a little bit of principles of effective oral presentation. And I mean that not only in terms of someone doing a PowerPoint. I'm actually a pretty bad example of PowerPoint. I use far too many words. But also ways of talking about it with reporters, with potential users, and with policymakers. I believe there are some particular techniques in oral presentation that can be critical. I've taught these things to lawyers in both the federal justice department and in private practice, and for a wide range of groups. On one-on-one, I think I can help make anyone an effective, really effective oral presenter. So we'll talk just a little bit about that today. And then if we have time, because so many of you are social scientists, data professionals, I'll talk a little bit about Robert Cialdini and his work on the principles of influence and persuasion, things that I believe are very important to have in the back of your mind when you're talking about trying to influence people, influence decisions, and in this case, in your case, persuade people about both the utility and the illustration that data provides. So that's our plan. It's a lot for a short presentation, but there you go. So what are the objectives here? My objectives are to help you maximize the visibility, the impact.
All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6.
Okay, I think that's done now, right? Is that okay, Mary? Everything okay? So to maximize the visibility, the impact, and the influence of the sort of the data that you work in, and in particular through the use of this information and these insights and these ideas to influence the course of decision making in your local government, at provincial and federal levels, and as I'm finding in the work I'm doing, institutionally. More work is being done in organized advocacy to influence the decisions of institutions, whether it be law societies or medical colleges. Overall, I'm hoping this will help you sharpen the political and communication skills that you have in your quiver. And hopefully we'll give you as many useful examples as possible to illustrate these points. So at one level, we're mainly talking here, I'm assuming, about how to have both policymakers and the media use knowledgeably data, especially the sort of work that you people do. So the comments I'm going to make here about mainstream media largely have to do with newspapers, broadcast outlets, and the like. But of course, we know that they are declining quite considerably as the principal media choice for many people. But I think we can argue that many of the principles we're going to be talking about here are equally applicable to either narrowcast media, like people who are writing on websites or blogs, or any of the other types of social media that are out there. My main message is to really be more effective with them, you need to understand them, and you need to be open to hearing what their particular needs are in terms of data. It's an eye glazer for some people. We need to concede that. So it's more than ever a competition for for eyeballs and attention. It's one that's frenetic and widespread in its scope. But it's happening at a time too when, largely because of the balkanization of the media, so many more new news media organizations popping up every day, many of them marginal, many of them very focused on a narrow demographic, but nonetheless, it's caused intense competition for the eyeballs. Just think in your own lives. Very few of you are probably as old as I am, but I mean, my thinking going back to the 60s, so there were 3 American channels, and depended where you lived in Canada, 1 or 2 Canadian channels, and that was the sum total of television. Radio was a much more important medium, certainly in the early 50s and in the 40s, than even television came to be. But because of this proliferation, there's enormous competition for resources, financial resources, and many newsrooms are, because of trying to feed the 24/7 news cycle, there's an endless need for material, for content, uh, which is one of the reasons why there's so much infotainment on television. They find that a relatively inexpensive way of providing content. But we need to be keeping in mind the lives of those people who are writing about these things. Reporters, journalists, I make a distinction between the two, and all others who are anyway expert or anyway acknowledged as legitimate couriers of information. They themselves are absolutely bombarded by pitches and special events and pleas for their attention to an issue. They don't get quite as much as most people in government do, but for those of you who are in government, you'll know that it's a never-ending stream of bombardment of requests for attention, assistance, money, action. So this, I think, is one of the factors that we all have such limited attention span. There's so much happening out there competing for our eyes, our ears, and our hearts and our skills. And very limited in the grand scope of the media, very limited opportunity for in-depth reporting or analysis. So those who actually really do that are all the more pursued by people who are trying to get them to speak to their issue. So what does this mean? Well, this is one man's view, but it really means that you've got to get into an extraordinary level of spoon feeding for many reporters, giving them both data and context, suggested storyline, and some sense of what does it all mean, because the data itself doesn't often convey that kind of narrative. It needs the juice of a story or narrative to make sense to it, particularly for those who are not experts. And yet, it's also important to know how to convey details, but not too much, not to overwhelm the recipient, in this case, a reporter, a journalist, or even a policymaker and policy advisor in government. You want to try and help craft or help focus their attention. You want to try and craft a narrative that helps bring that data alive. And also, especially in broadcast media and also in newspapers, they want context-related images, pictures, video. Now, some of this stuff you can just make connections as well to other news stories to help them understand what's happening. But also another thing that's very helpful for reporters is tables, illustrative tables that show various points of view or various grades of opinion on a particular issue, or that show clearly a correlation between income and education, or any of the other types of data that would be likely subject of your work. So Even though I'm largely talking here about the mainstream media and describing the phenomenon in current mainstream media, uh, much of this also applies to anyone for which you're trying to draw their attention and focus on a particular issue. So, what do I suggest you do to uh, draw this attention to
Sean, sorry,
be
Sean.
much more, have your data being much
Sean,
more
I'm just going to interrupt
broadly
you for a
used?
second. Do you mind speaking up a little
There are
bit?
7 things I'm going to describe very briefly to you.
Thank you.
Yes, yes. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Maybe I'll speak a little closer to the mic here. Sorry about that. So, the first thing I'm going to talk to you about is a notion that I call strategic inquiry. It's an invented term. I've stolen different parts of the idea from various places. I call it research. And even though it's primarily about influencing people in places of authority in government, I believe it can be equally important in terms of developing a good, sustaining, productive relationship with the news media. So we'll talk a bit about strategic inquiry. Secondly, as part of that, we'll talk about the importance of story and narrative in effectively conveying data and the policy issues that data is related to. You'll hear me talk of the concept of theme sculpting a bit. Now, this comes pretty close in many people's minds to spin, I suppose, but so be it. We want to just talk a little bit about some of the ways of framing your narrative um, and help it convey more in a more pointed term the sort of themes that you think are important. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the creation of a media contact list that I suggest community data evolve over time in developing as well, but also individually. If you're really interested in getting more reach for your data, if you're really interested in getting the type of serious discussion about issues to include the type of data that you and your colleagues will work in, then it's important to bring some focus to it by having a simple thing like a media list. Who are the 10 or 12 reporters, commentators, maybe other academics, maybe columnists that you want to try and bring your stories, your ideas, and your data and have them put to good use. I'm then going to talk about a media contact note. And this is one of the things that I've provided a handout on. The one I've provided is not specifically for data professionals. Rather, I produced it some years ago to help uh, various interest groups, especially in the disability sector, frankly, to get more attention on their issues from the media. Example of the spoon feeding I was talking about earlier. We'll get into that in more detail. I'm then going to cite a type of newsletter, electronic email-based newsletter that I believe has been used very effectively uh, by 2 different producers, essentially kind of on the same issues, but they're 2 different sources of information. One is from Michael Mahar of a group called Smart Justice Network of Canada, and the other is Anthony Dube, a professor emeritus of criminology at the University of Toronto. We're going to give them some good examples of how to do some ongoing promotion of data and research. And lastly, I'll talk about the notion of a community data directory of data expertise. Give you some examples of that later. So they are the 7 ideas we're going to focus on here. Needless to say, touching on all of them rather briefly. So, um, you know, people oftentimes ask me if are there any net bottom lines to advocacy, to which I will say yes, and it's best expressed by two people, one from around 2,000 years ago and the other from about 50 years ago. The first is the Roman philosopher, statesman, and theoretician about rhetoric and politics and influence and persuasion, Cicero. If you wish to persuade me, you must think my thoughts, feel my feelings, and speak my words. In other words, if you want to influence someone in any way, you need to know where they're coming from. You need to know about how they think. You need to know about what their priorities and their focus are. It's very difficult to come up with a thoughtful strategy of influencing or persuading someone without knowing that. In the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, for those of you who are of an age that you'll remember the tumult of the 60s, the name Saul Alinsky will mean something to you. He's also the guy whose organization gave a young lawyer from Hawaii his first job in community organizing before he went on to become president of the United States. And Alinsky said a variation on what Cicero said. If you want to communicate effectively with someone, you need to communicate within their experience. So those two things very much inform my approach to advocacy generally, and how you operationalize them is key. So the first notion is this notion of strategic inquiry. Simply put, it's a focused, intentional effort to try and understand the environment around which the person you are dealing with, government, an individual, the environment that surrounds the issue that you are dealing with. But it's about listening, it's about taking in, it's about understanding. It's not about lobbying, it's not about advocacy. In fact, it's all about asking advice of those involved in decision making, or in this case, journalists, for their advice, because that becomes then part of an insight into how they think, what they think is important, and how they operate. But it's also about establishing and building a relationship. I don't know about you, but when I'm basically a shy guy, and when I go to cocktail parties or any other social events and I'm in groups of people, to me, the best way of starting a conversation with someone and getting them learning about them is asking them questions, asking them about their work, asking them about what they think about things. Most people love thinking about, or love talking about those sorts of subjects. So that's the notion of strategic inquiry, that before you go to someone with an ask in government, before you go to make a pitch, learn as much as you possibly can about those individuals. So, and here's the way I suggest doing it. And there's a handout for this here too. I'm like Elizabeth Warren, I've got a plan for everything here. It's one I call Advocacy School Template for a Strategic Inquiry Briefing Note. In terms of dealing with people in government, and I would suggest the media, if you want to try and get them on the phone for 40 minutes to get their advice, it's best to tell them in advance, ideally in a short note, what it is you want to talk to them about. It's as simple as that. It makes a huge difference when you want to, for instance, get in to see a bureaucrat, or if you want to see a policy advisor, or if you want to see a politician. Especially politicians, the more senior they go, they will not have a meeting unless someone gives them a briefing note about it. So this is an example of that type of briefing note. But where this fits in is in the steps in strategic inquiry. A, frame the issue, put the words around your topic in a good general way. It doesn't need to be terribly precise. It needs to be concise. If you're doing this for the purpose of trying to influence a decision of government, you should have at the back of your mind at least your preliminary ask. In other words, what you think you may want the government to do, but it's not something you're going to focus on in your discussion. You should then do a quick, what we call mapping issue. For those of you involved in social policy, you'll be well familiar with this. It's identifying the players. So in the case of journalists of the media, who are the players in that issue. Yeah, in health, for example, it's Andre Picard of the Globe and Mail, and you could add another 4 or 5 big health reporters. If it's urban affairs, you could probably easily find out who they are. But you want to try and identify the, uh, the universe of people that you want to have this sort of exchange with. Then send this 2-page, actually ideally 1-page strategic inquiry briefing note that sets out, the issue, what organization you're from, just like 2 lines and maybe a website, uh, several bullets and background, just give them a general idea of the subject area you want to talk about. And then lastly, briefly, a short paragraph on why you want to chat with them, what it is you want to explore, what it is you want to understand. And in this case, it may be a broad issue of where do you see data coming up in good, responsible coverage of health policy, or whatever the subject matter is. Now, people say, isn't the best way to actually go and meet people? Absolutely, it is. But in today's world, it's a lot easier to book someone on the phone for a 20 or 40-minute discussion than it is to actually see them in a meeting. It sort of confines them in time and place. But something on the phone, they can do it from their cottage, they can do it from their car. All they got to do is book the time. And what you've asked is a maximum 40 minutes each. It's only half an hour short, where you can get the drift of what you want from them in that discussion. Strongly recommend you send a thank you note. One of those rarest.
Sean? Sorry, yes. Sean?
Yes.
It's yes. Mary. I'm just going to pause you for a second. I'm getting some more background, so I'm going to try to do the mute again, so it's going to interrupt. So just hang on 1 second, please.
All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6.
You still there, Mary?
All right, go ahead again, Sean. Thanks very much.
Okay. So what strategic inquiry is meant to explore in the context of influencing decisions of government is, what do the people you are talking to, what do they think they know about the issue? What do they think is important? If you're talking to people in government, how does it fit into individual or government's priorities? And if you really want to get into this, and I think this is more important than for those trying to influence the decisions of government than in your instance, where that's a kind of an indirect objective of yours. It's important to think about it in 5 ways when you're talking about an issue. What's the public policy context? Is this a public health issue? Is it an economic development issue? What is usually a number of public policy contexts in which an issue can be viewed? Secondly, how is it positioned? What are the words, the language, the concepts, the descriptions that are used by either, in this case, reporters or policy advisors? How are they describing it? Thirdly, if you're dealing with someone in government, what's the process in place? What's the process that's taking form on how this issue is going to be decided? Well, similarly with journalists, how do they go about dealing with certain stories? Do they start with policy and then talk about, or start with data and then talk about policy options? Or are they, as is the case oftentimes in government, people decide what the policy option is, then they go looking for the data to support it? Either way, it's important to try and understand that sort of process. Fourthly, precedent. In dealing with government and policymakers, it's always important to understand what precedents they think this is either consistent with or going against. It's oftentimes a key factor in government. In other words, if we do this for one group, well, we have to do it with another. And lastly, the politics of the issue. I'm not going to get into that right now. If people are interested, we can talk about it later. But what I mean by that is trying to understand at least the small p politics around every issue. So out of this, and another reason you want to do this is to understand what is the narrative, what is the context in which the issues that you're concerned about are going to be described. And this is very important, I think, in terms of attracting media attention to what you're doing, but as well the attention of policymakers. Trying to craft the data in a context that almost anyone can relate to, something that illustrates the scale of an issue or the nature of an issue. But in doing this narrative, we don't want to be talking about necessarily a long, expansive narrative. That can come for use in other more detailed written product. But you also need to try and come up with kind of an elevator version of it. I'm sure you all have heard the term elevator message. In other words, if you catch someone on an elevator, you've been trying to get to see them, you have 45 seconds to explain your issue or your pitch. What is it you're going to say? That offends, I know, many people in the research community. And I'm not saying that should be your full message, but you need to be able to do a framing of it that can be conveyed quickly in order to give you the opportunity to go into more detail later. Now, the reason we mention this here is that this is some of the stuff that you're exploring when you're doing strategic inquiry with journalists. What are those themes? What are those issues that were most of interest to that reporter that could help you be more effective in dealing with them? Now, this slide is what I use when I'm dealing with non-data professionals, and very much would look forward to any comment you have on any of this, by the way, because I talk so much about the need for the use of data and the creative and constructive use of it. Your advice on this would be very helpful as well. People outside of government, outside of policy circles, may not really know what we mean by evidence-based public policy or decision-making. To them, oftentimes, the most important thing is people are as mad as hell and they want to do something about it. They may not understand the nuances of it much. But you have the capacity in your various areas of activity of really putting some meat on the bones of what is evidence-based public policy. And at the same time, be yet another tool for illustrating a story that needs to be told for there to be broad understanding of an issue. Now, let me just show you how a couple of groups have dealt with taking data and getting it out there, not only to reporters, but to people in government as well. Both of these groups I'm talking about are involved in an issue area that I'm involved in on a pro bono basis with criminal justice reform in Canada. It's a hard issue to have people pay attention to. It's a hard issue for most politicians. They usually don't want to touch it. But it's very important on so many levels in terms of our society and how we deal with people. So the first one, and the objective here by both these groups, is to get more eyeballs attracted to the sort of subject matter that they deal with. So please tell me whether this is going to show. I think it is, Mary. This is the University of Toronto Centre for Criminology and Sociological Studies. And this is produced by Professor Anthony Dube and a colleague of his. Unfortunately, escapes me right now. This goes out almost every month, and it goes to reporters, it goes to politicians, and I get it on a regular basis. And here's an example of what it does. If you can see this, there are about 8 topics here, and these are research initiatives dealing with each of these. In some cases, they're picking it out of a larger body of research. In some cases, these are being formed. So here's one on policing of homeless people and its impact on police-initiated events. So here's the reference of the person who did it. There's data spread throughout this very brief contextual presentation of the issue. And I'll leave this with you. You can pick it up off your the PowerPoints that you have, but you can see these topics, all of them, having to do with criminal justice issues in Canada. The other one is by the Smart Justice of Network of Canada. This one is produced by Michael Mahar, a retired Catholic priest who's quite involved in criminal justice reform. And he does this, again, on a no cost, no fee basis. And these are thumbnail sketches of individual research projects. Sometimes they're news reports, all having to do with criminal justice reform. So if you're interested in that sort of issue, either as a journalist or a public official, they're just great sources of information. They're not waiting for journalists to come to them. They're out there promoting that sort of work. So that briefing note that I talked about, that way of delivering information to people, is something I call do-it-yourself public policy. It assumes that if you want to attract attention to things, you've got to do a lot of the work yourself. You can't wait for someone else to do it. So whether it's briefing notes, speaking notes, one example would be if you know a minister is, some public official is coming to town someday to talk about an issue, why don't you email them ahead some data that you might have that would be relevant and interesting for them, for inclusion in it. Use that as one of the levers for the heightening the awareness of your issue. I'll talk about those in more detail later if you want to do it yourself public policy things. But bottom line on this is you got to try new things and new ways of grabbing attention in an increasingly competitive market. I'm going to leave it there for now. If we have a bit more time later, I do want to go a little bit into understanding the social psychology of persuasion. I think that can be quite useful for people. The one thing I should just go back to briefly, I don't have a slide for it, but I do want to speak to them before we get into the Q&A. It's this last thing, this notion of a community data directory. That can be done very simply, but let me give you an example of what was done along those lines some years ago. It's not in publication now because it's online, but the Canadian Association of Journalists, along with another group whose name escapes me right now, decided to create kind of a directory for journalists on everything that's happening out there. So B, Blood Services. Here are the contacts at the Canadian Blood Services Agency. Here are some of the academics that have researched issues related to blood. P, Pandemic.
Sean, we still see your slide deck. Did you need to bring up a different document? We still see the slides.
Are individuals. Yes? Yes?
Oh, okay. That's fine.
Yes.
Thanks, Sean.
No, I don't. Yes, I know, and I don't have slides for these two things that I'm talking about. One is that community data directory, which I suggest you could ultimately create and put online. There'd certainly be some costs about it, but to have the community data directory be a go-to place for reporters when they want to find out if there's any research on issues. Not just reporters, I might add. I deal with lots of nonprofit groups who can't afford survey research. They can't afford big analytical pieces to commission, but they would love to know where to get that stuff. I mean, I give them ways of getting government data free, survey research, for example. But one idea you may want to consider is developing some sort of community data directory where journalists, interest groups across the country can go to and find out who they could chat with and what kind of data is already available. The one other thing which I mentioned, but I didn't spend enough time chatting about, is the media contact note, which I've sent as an example one that we produced to help organizations get the media to deal with their issues in an election time. So it's just a template, just headings, but you know, a quick description of what the issue is, a bit of background. Uh, what are some story ideas for it? What are some visuals? And because this is an election-oriented one, what are some potential questions for media to put to candidates? These are things that are sent to the assignment editors of newspapers and broadcast locations, pointing out to them story ideas that their news organization can pursue. And just try and do it in a one-pager so that it's easy to read, easy for you to produce, and easy for the recipient to absorb. So that's the, why don't we just turn now to any Q&A that's out there, Mary? I'd be happy to entertain those sorts of questions.
Hi, Sean. Sorry. I've got double speakers going. Does everybody hear me clearly?
I'm going to stop sharing, okay?
Sorry. Yeah. Yep, that's fine. Yeah, and I'm going to, yeah, you click on your thing. Sorry, we'll get everybody over here. So one of the questions was providing resources for nonprofits. Now, I think most of the work you're doing now is with nonprofits and looking at sort of how to make resources out of not a lot of, maybe not a lot of financial resources.
Yeah. Well, can you hear me now, Mary?
I can, yep.
You can. Well, at Advocacy School, we have different categories of work. There's some certain work I do pro bono. I'm not charging for this one today. For a variety of public interest groups. But most of our work is for professional associations, um, large charities. Just finished doing some work for the Kidney Foundation of Canada. I'm doing work for a couple of foundations. They're asking me to coach some of the social enterprises they're involved with. And yes, we do work in First Nations, and there's 2 or 3 NGOs, environmental groups, and foundations in Europe we're doing work for right now. But I hear a lot from all sorts of groups in the disability community, in the anti-poverty movement, about resources. Data comes up. It's one of the ones that come up. Many of them are fortunate enough to have some really good researchers who are also volunteering to help them. But there's other things too. An incredible sense. I mean, people keep on telling them they don't have the power, and there's a huge power imbalance, and it's such an inhibitor for people. I try to give them some good practical advice on how they can get to talk to people who are important in the policy making process. It's not complicated. My workshop is generally called an advocacy, how the system works and how to work the system. And I think major change can be affected over time by a lot of groups that frankly just go about it in a rather clumsy way. Any other questions?
There was a follow-up question to that was looking at specific resources, looking at childhood poverty and homelessness. I mean, I think
Um,
that, I mean, do you have anything, I guess the question is, I mean, you have the resources on criminal justice. Do you have anything similar looking at homelessness or child poverty?
I don't. I don't. And if you
Okay,
do,
and then,
please send it to me so I can answer that question in the future. No, I don't. I don't. Um, no, I don't have repositories of information on that. Um, but typical of someone who's been a lobbyist and an advocate, um, I very seldom know anything about an issue when people first come to me, but I can usually find some shortcuts on how to learn important things quickly. Mainly by,
okay, and then we did have a
mainly
question.
by asking advice. I mean, to me, it's the most effective advocacy tool is having the humility to ask for advice and ask for advice of people who are in and around the issue. That's a constant message I have for anyone, no matter what the issue is they're trying to advocate on.
Okay, and we did have somebody asking a follow-up question on the social psychology of persuasion.
Sure. I'm going to have
You
to
want
go
to get
back
into
to
that?
sharing to do that.
Sure.
See,
You
how do
open up that screen again.
I made it go away. Actually, why could you just bring it up on your screen? It's the last two slides in the electronic version of PowerPoint that I sent
Yeah,
you.
hang on. Let me see if I can find it here.
Bring up the presentation and I'll direct you there. Let me just, while we're waiting, let me just tell you a little about what Robert Cialdini, his research started off as kind of market research, and he explored and got quite interested in the notion of what makes for really good sellers of product ideas, everything from soap to cars. What are the that's the wrong argument. And he has written a couple of books, which I highly recommend to you. Um, this one in particular is called Cialdini, Influence, Science, and Practice. Now, it's quite a few years ago now. He's written several since. How do I get the big screen up? There we go. And he sees 6 principles of persuasion. Again, his initial analysis was based on how people persuade others to sell or persuade to buy goods and services. And in the second slide, I will talk about the application of those principles in the context of public policy advocacy, trying to sell ideas to decision makers. So the first one is reciprocation, and it's one we would all recognize in daily form. You do a favor for someone and they will do a favor for you. Now, you can take that approach, reciprocation, and very quickly turn it into a criminal act by bribing people, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how the notion that people are more willing to comply with requests for services, for information, anything else, if those who they're talking with have provided them first. So this is why, in a kind of an indirect way, why salesmen will bring each of their best clients a bottle of scotch for Christmas time. It's that part of engendering goodwill and offering to be helpful. We'll give you some public policy examples of that in a few minutes. The second is the importance of commitment and consistency. People are more willing to be moved in a particular direction if they see it as just kind of an extension of what they've already committed to. This is a hugely important factor in what in commerce commerce they call brand loyalty. If you can get people using your product, and it works out well, they out of habit will continue to buy that product. Similarly, in almost all areas of commerce. There's all sorts of reasons for it. Some people are too lazy to make a change. Some of them just immediately feel a sense of confidence in dealing with that provider. And what the hell, they've already made the decision they like this. The third is authority. People are more willing to follow the directions or recommendations of someone to whom they attribute relative authority or expertise. Good example of that is on certain types of toothpaste, you'll see approved as the most, I don't know what the language is, certainly types of toothpaste by some dental related organization. Or something that's been given the sanction of a professional association or some group. It becomes a bit of a shortcut in decision making by people if they can see that some sort of authority is supportive of that. We'll talk later about the political application of that. Social validation. People were willing to take a recommended action if they see evidence that the many others, especially people like them, are doing it. You know, top selling product must have something going for it, so it's the one that I take a look at. If most fishermen are buying this product, then something I should take a look at. Scarcity is a rather a base instinct that this applies to. For example, this is what a lot of Black Friday commerce is all about. You know, first 100 people in the door get a TV. If things are limited in availability, then they seem to be somewhat more attractive. And then lastly, vastly underrated and oftentimes, is just liking and friendship. People prefer to say yes, or they prefer to do business with those whom they know and like. So what are the roughly parallel phenomenon when we take notions of persuasion into the advocacy realm? Well, in the context of reciprocation, again, this is where excessive reciprocation can give you big problems. There's rules, certainly in the federal government, about how many times public servants can take hospitality from anyone outside government over the course of the year. I think it's once a year they can do now. So there's real limits on how much you can do that. There's real limits on being able to take out politicians or bureaucrats to dinner or an Ottawa Senators game, especially an Ottawa Senators game. Very tough to get people out to that these days. But in ethical terms, in terms of government guidelines, real restrictions on using excessive reciprocation, goods and hospitality to people in government. But they don't have to be tangible gifts. They can be information, they can be insight, they can be bringing things to the attention of people that from time to time you want to talk to learn more about what's happening in a government department. How can you help them in any way? Secondly, commitment and consistency. This is very much the case in a lot of public policy. If you can get a government to, for example, consider doing a pilot project on a particular issue, especially if the pilot project turns out to be relatively positive, it's going to be easier to get them to move to the next state, maybe a broader application of that same principle. In other words, building on small successes and modest requests. I call it relentless incrementalism, which in many areas of public policy is the real way to get results. Thirdly, social proof. If you can show people in government, for example, that there are other people like them, there are other governments like them that are doing the sort of thing you're talking about. Of course, this is very important, oftentimes in government decision making. What are other jurisdictions doing? How are they dealing with this particular issue. So it adds a legitimacy, it adds a sense of, well, it's a reduction in risk is what it is for many people in government to know that other governments and agencies have considered such course of action. Authority, sure, much the same sort of thing. What are the kind of especially objective, disinterested names or organizations you can point out to government as supporting the sort of thing that you are talking about? The scarcity thing's a little more tough to make a parallel on, though I've certainly had experience with using it. You're trying to get a politician to agree to take a leadership role on a particular issue, and they and their staff are telling you they're really busy, they got a lot on their plate, they wish you well, but they really don't have the time for it. Now, all the time you need to do is suggest to them that you'll then go to one of their rivals within the same political party, someone that they're always competing with influence within the party, and suggest that you'll go to them and see if you can get them involved. All of a sudden, your issue may become a matter of scarcity for them, which and they want to take advantage of that opportunity. They don't want the other guy to get it. So it's crude, but it sometimes works. And then lastly, the liking and friendship. Once you start, this is why this notion of strategic inquiry is the beginning of a relationship. You're asking them for advice. You're trying to move towards, you're trying to establish a relationship where you can phone them at almost any time. But in particular, you want to have a relationship with that person so that if they see something happening in government that might impact your issue or impact your organization, they're more likely to get in touch with you and give you a heads up. So that's my rough approximation of the theories of Cialdini about influence and persuasion as it applies to public policy advocacy, and hopefully, at least indirectly, to the concerns that you have. Mary? Mary, are you there?
That's great, Sean. Yep, sorry. It takes me a few minutes to switch my mute speakers and everything else. I think that's really helpful, and I would just put that to everybody on the line now. If you want to go ahead and share in the chat box how you can see that working, looking through that list of notes that Sean has in front of you, just think about how you're already working with any of those. Like, do you have obvious authorities that you already align with that you sort of bring onto projects, or is that sort of something that's maybe missing in your work? Sean, if you give up your, you should be able to stop sharing your screen by clicking on a little black box. If you go into Adobe.
I'm trying to do that.
There'd be a little speaker box somewhere.
Yeah. Just get rid of these things. Yeah, I don't know how to, I can't find a way of doing that. Sorry.
Sorry, folks, we're just going to, should be able to stop sharing your screen. Should be something. Okay, I'm going to click request control. Oh, there you go.
Okay.
Okay,
sorry.
So I'm going to just bring the presentation back up so we can have it in front of us here. I think it's worth just going through some of these points and thinking through from the group. Let me switch through everybody.
Well, I see a couple here with, do you want me just to speak to them? Ernie with trauma and mental health being
Sure. Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Here, yeah, you should be able to work the slides, John, if you want to bring it up.
Okay, well, I won't, there's nothing more for me to say about the slides, but Ernie, your question, how do we align our policies around the issue? Well, it's actually happening at an extraordinary level, I think. And a lot of the credit goes to 2 or 3 bodies that have been very effective in engaging on public health or mental health issues. The Mental Health Commission of Canada, I think, has been particularly attuned to how you raise the consciousness on this. And of course, one of the manifestations of that is to try and get both everything from government PSAs to Bell Canada ads through to changes that a lot of people, for example, outside government wouldn't notice, and that would be the health, the enormous amount of effort that's being put in health and wellness initiatives within the government of Canada. Uh, now, how much of a difference they've made, I don't know. But when you think how far that issue has got in the last 10 years, it's really quite remarkable. The more disturbing thing for me is the relative seeming incidence of various types of mental health, especially anxiety among young people. And I, for one, would love to know if there's a public policy response to that. But again, this is where I think the data is very important, especially when we're talking about incidents. When we're not saying, some will argue you're trying to normalize certain behavior. Well, we're not trying to normalize it. What we are trying to do is destigmatize it as much as possible and point out that it's not just people on the margin who suffer this way. I don't know if that's much of an answer, but COVID-19 influencing the social psychology of people. It's probably freaking them out. But again, this is where data is very important. A good friend of mine, who some of you may have met, died last summer tragically. But he had started up a Canadian-based NGO that was advising governments around the world on how to deal with pandemics. He's been saying for years that one of these was likely to hit, and one of the most important things is public confidence that the information they're getting from public authorities, whether it's good information or bad, is reliable and consistent. And so there's another example of how important data is, even if it's delivering bad news. Dealing with the Ford government, are these persuasion principles still valid? It seems likely they dislike authority and have taken a stand against anything progressive. I feel they're kind of into authoritarianism, if not authority. But listen, I've been involved in a number of things involving the disabled, and you know that is one area the Ford government has had a lot of problems with, and they've walked back on a lot of things. And I can't tell you that any of the half dozen initiatives that I was involved in were key to that, but they all experienced a surprising degree of pushing back on the government. And a lot of that had to do with trying to understand where the government was coming from. Some people think that if you do that, you're just validating them. Well, no, you do need to know where they're coming from. And you also need to know where other people in their caucus are coming from. On those issues in which the Ford government has made a reversal of policy, ranging from francophone affairs to autism to other disability-related issues, they walked back in part because they had such a violent reaction from some members of their caucus. And they were identified in large part by listening carefully to what the caucus was thinking about those things. Not all of them sympathetically to our cause, but it helped a lot because we helped put together, I say we, I played a very minor role in putting together a sub-caucus of conservative members who would start to lobby their own government on these issues. Oftentimes, the natural instinct for a lot of organizations is to go to the opposition parties and use them to amplify their criticism. And trust me, that only goes so far. It's satisfying because you do something and immediately the opposition parties will be up, maybe parroting what you're saying, but that's not necessarily the best way to make an advance on the issue. Anyway, more of that if you're interested. But so I think you need to try and get into their thinking. As I mentioned at the beginning, you need to understand how their decisions are made, and to try and find those individuals that can make a difference. Now, I didn't give you my 9 principles of effective public policy advocacy. That was not on the agenda today. But one of them is, if you want to be successful in your advocacy, you almost always need a sponsor for your proposition within the government. One former senior official told me, he said, if you can't find anyone in the government, bureaucracy or the political level, who doesn't buy what you're saying, that's God's way of saying you're asking for the wrong thing. And to me, one of the most important things in any advocacy is to consider what your ask is. And before you formulate that ask of government, it's important to do strategic inquiry and understand where the government's coming from and where the various influencers are on the issue. Frankly, I don't know how to lobby unless you do that sort of stuff. It's kind of the lobbyist version of evidence-based public policy. I like to be able to show to a client why we're suggesting that they ask for a certain thing, why we're taking a particular approach. You can't just pull those things out of the air. They should be based on some reading of reality. Any other questions?
Hi, everybody. It's Mary again. I just put a question out there. Just wondering if anybody has already developed relationships just over the course of your work with either politician or journalist that really sort of have access to the greater public, that you've been able to really supply data for and given numbers and sort of given some of the evidence to support what they're trying to push forward. Has anybody already sort of found those relationships, or is this a fairly new concept for folks? This is a real question, so I'm watching the chat box to see your answers as they come in. Sean, I like your point that even, you know, it's worth knowing the people in charge, even if they're not necessarily going in the direction you are going or that your data is showing, but knowing where they come from and being able to work within, you know, the side that's in charge and the side that's in power at that time, and be able to work on that.
I see James McEwen saying the Poverty Task Force has done an excellent job of making those relationships. That's right, and it has to be a matter of intentionality. The initiative really rests with the proponent in those situations. So making the contact, and I should say not just with the politicians, but oftentimes, more importantly, with their policy advisors. I, for one, think that there's way too much emphasis placed on dealing with politicians in our Canadian system. Our system relies very heavily on the advice of public servants. Now, I know there are some governments that are at war with their public service because they don't like the type of answers, the type of ideas that they get from them. But if you want to understand what's happening in a government, it's very important to talk to the bureaucrats and to the political assistants to the politicians and the ministers. 9 times out of 10, they only know what they're being told. So it's important to play a role in what they're being told.
Right, and so often it's actually more effective to actually develop the relationship with the policy advisor and build something with them and be able to support them in what they're trying to put forward, because they already have the ear of the politician. And I mean, their time is not as, what's the word for it? You know, policy advisors sometimes have a longer look at things than
Yes,
the politicians do. If they're just, you're right, they're just going with what's put in front of them. And so that makes sense to look towards the policy advisors as building relationships that way.
At the risk of overly generalizing, I find that at least 8 to 9 times out of 10, a politician, a minister, or a senior official, or a senior politician, or a minister, is usually following the advice of his officials. You may say that sounds like a huge percentage, but keep in mind that oftentimes, especially when very conservative politicians have been elected, the bureaucrats do adjust their both analysis and recommendations, because if they don't, they're going to be in another job. They learn to accommodate. Accommodate themselves. They'll, for instance, in dealing with the Harper government early on in its years, I was in private practice at the law firm at that time. We were dealing a lot with the Harper government. And one of the things we learned for the first 2 years of the Harper government is don't put the word social in anything. Social policy, social entrepreneurship, social finance. You just didn't do it because they were still heavily reformist and right of center, and to them, social meant socialism. It was shocking, really, the visceral reaction they had against it. So we found all sorts of ways of not inflaming them and finding other ways of describing issues. Usually putting the word family in made a big difference. So, for instance, family caregiving was something I was quite involved in. And we found we had to go out and find different groups that we tried to align with in the conservative ecosystem. There's a lot of them family oriented. And we found that as long as we focused on the things we agreed on, not the things we disagreed with, you had the real potential for advance. One of the most dramatic examples of that is something called the Registered Disability Savings Plan, the RDSP. That was in the works for many years. Various liberal governments looked at it, played with it, didn't really pick it up. And then when the new Harper government was elected, at this point I was a little bit involved with the organization that was sponsoring it. We reframed the discussion quite considerably. And key to it was getting a sponsor for this notion. What I mean by a sponsor, someone who likes the idea, is prepared to give you advice on how to move the idea, and ideally in a position to do it themselves. And in this case, it was the now late Jim Flaherty, Minister of Finance, who thought he had a particular soft spot for disability because one of his triplet sons is multiply disabled. And he thought this was a good example of the type of social policy the Harper government should do. And he was a very major proponent. It happened. He was finance minister. He could help make it happen. And it was a great example of several things we've talked about today, and we'll have to leave that further discussion to another day. City of Calgary, we have relationships with many politicians from our city council. However, oftentimes the data doesn't necessarily support the political decisions that are being contemplated. Yep. Well, that context and complexity that you say you add is very important. But again, this is where this marriage between data and narrative is important. And that we could have a great little workshop or discussion about different ways of doing that. Fortunately, I don't have the time today, but yeah. So this is why I think for people who are involved in data, their ability to provide constructive narrative and compelling narratives is very important. And one of the ways of developing that content is to do some serious listening of the people that you're trying to influence. You may find the narrative pretty offensive, or you may find their views less than convincing or sometimes offensive. But if they're there and there's no alternative to dealing with them, you have to think about other ways of framing that narrative. And along with that, perhaps mobilizing groups that he may be more susceptible to than others. On the Registered Disability Savings Plan, one of the groups that was very helpful were a series of faith-based groups who also brought some pretty serious heft to the argument dealing with the federal government.
All right, folks, we've got Sean for about 12 more minutes. So if you've got any other questions about the material that he's given you here, or if you've got anything to share that you'd like some feedback on, now is the time to get typing in there.
And I also invite any of you, if you have any particular questions about your situation and your issue, I'd be happy to hear from you directly. If you want to do that privately, my contact information is at the end of the PowerPoint presentation.
And why don't I bring that up here too? No. Maybe it's at the beginning. Yeah, so we have Kevin saying, Sean, have you got any thoughts on evidence-based decision-making versus decision-based evidence-making?
Well, you know, I'm a big proponent of evidence-based decision-making, but I must say, more often than not, I see the data sought and used after a decision has been made. In other words, they'll select data and other types of evidence to support a proposition. You know, I'm not entirely sure what you can do about that. One of the things that I'm a big proponent of, even though I'm a retired lobbyist and still advise people on lobbying and advocacy, there are alternatives to lobbying government when you're trying to influence a decision of government. And this sounds like it's splitting hairs a little bit, but it's a distinction that I make a lot when I'm dealing with interest groups, like, you know, foundations or charities or social justice groups, that just coming up with an ask of government, even if it's well researched and you've done your strategic inquiry and you've framed that ask in a way that maximizes the prospect of success, and then you go out there and try to sell that idea to policy advisors and the executive branch of government, as well as politicians. There is an alternative, and it's one that's being increasingly used at the federal level. It was not much used during the Harper years, and in many provincial governments, and at the local level, I'm finding in particular. And it's what is called policy engagement, different than policy advocacy. Now, again, different people use different terms, but here's the difference. In policy advocacy, you're coming up with a particular idea, your idea of a solution to an issue, and you're trying to sell it. Policy engagement's different. Policy engagement is you, your organization, trying to broaden support among other stakeholder groups for a proposition or a way of looking at an issue, and then getting government, luring government in, if you use one verb, into a policy engagement process where it has about 3 phases. First, you try and get together in discussion, people not coming in with anything other than some general ideas. It's not a time to go in to sell a particular course of action, but you try to engage government and other stakeholders in a discussion of what is the issue we're here to talk about. How are we framing this issue? How are we defining what the nature of the problem or the challenge or the opportunity is? And then you have a second meeting over maybe a month or two in which you're talking about options of dealing with that issue. Not only in terms of public policy, but what the individual stakeholders can do as well. We all get together on a particular issue. What are the different ways we can deal with it? And then the third phase, which is usually a couple months later, is coming to a consensus decision on what the response should be. Now, that process is very different than lobbying because it's more iterative, it's more deliberative. It gives an opportunity for those in government to share with those outside government some of the concerns that they may have, but the objective is to try and come to a consensus agreement on the way forward. The best recent example of that is the initiative launched by a number of foundations in Canada to promote social innovation, social entrepreneurship, and social finance. And very different than the previous government in responses to particularly social and environmental issues. And they did that over the course of about 9 months. They started off just defining what the issues are, and they talked a little bit about the options. They had about 3 or 4, actually probably half a dozen meetings. And at the end of it, they announced $1 billion program on social entrepreneurship and social innovation. So, and that's a pretty abstract issue. I got to tell you, when we started working on that many years ago, in the dawn of the Harper government, as I mentioned, we couldn't even get the government interested in the notion of social, let alone any of these other things. So again, we've done different workshops on this and ways forward using alternatives to just lobbying. And data is very important in that second one, in defining what the issue is and exploring and testing what the options might be. Okay.
Well, folks, we are just about out of time here, so I'm going to take some time and just say thank you very much for attending and joining us today and for your questions for Sean. Sean, thank you very much for putting this all together for us. I know you spend a lot of time getting big training programs going, and we appreciate you putting this together for us. I hope this is a really good introduction for everybody and sort of changes how you might approach the relationships between, your policy advisors or other people that you can sort of get on board with what you're doing and that you can provide some data for and get your work out there and hopefully have it be a little bit more impactful in your community than it was last year. This is an issue that we're going to keep talking about with the Community Data Program. We're going to talk about what it would be to have our own directory of data people and what that could do as far as networking and also just sort of trying to get data out there on the national level and be ready to talk about and support some of the stories that are going around and get some of that actual evidence in there. So we'll definitely be carrying this conversation forward. Please go check out Sean's school, the Advocacy School. It's really interesting and definitely worth a few minutes of your time to check out. And if you do have any further questions, you can follow up with me or with Sean himself. All of his contact information is on the website, and so you can definitely follow up separately with him. So thank you very much, Sean. We really appreciate it. And
I appreciate it,
if anybody wants to stick around, I'm going to thanks, Sean. So we're going to let Sean leave us. I will pull up those files that he provided us with onto the screen again. So I will leave the webinar room open for a few more minutes so you can get a hold of those if you would like. So thanks, everyone.